Uh, Thank you all for being here and taking part. And now I would like to open this meeting. Professor Ungvári, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody. And I'm really glad and we are honored to have Duška Radosavljević as an entity. And let me present myself. I'm Ildikó Ungvári, for those who do not know me. And let me present a very our guests from other countries, Maya and Carlos and Tanya and Yuri, and I'd like to welcome Professor Lazo, Professor Albert, and Aural, and my colleague Gábor. So, and these are our students and colleagues, Dan Kirékai too, and sorry I forgot you. And want to tell one more thing, that this occasion is organized by the Hungarian Academy of Science, the Committee of Cluj and the Performance Studies Committee in collaboration with the Doctoral School of our university. And I think that's all that I wanted to say. Yes, those who attend online, please mute your microphones, and probably there will be time to write your questions in chat if that is okay for us. What's your opinion? Yes, okay. So the floor is you. Duška Radosavljević is a friend of our university. I may say so. She's a dramaturg, an academic, and a scholar, and she will present her lecture on Aural and Aural Dramaturgies, and which is an innovation of the digital age.
There's a question mark.
Okay, let's read the question mark.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are improvising a bit because actually, I think Ildikó invited me last week to do this presentation, and I just assumed I'm doing a lecture, but now it turned out that actually Ildikó has quite a few questions. So I will try and keep the lecture bit very short to make more space for questions.
Yes, yes. Yes. Thought. Yeah. It was a very rapid exchange of ideas.
Yes, yes. But it makes sense maybe to just present the project, give you a kind of an overarching idea of what it's been. I have already spoken to the students this morning who were in the workshop this morning about some aspects of the project. I didn't have much time to go into the sort of theoretical framing of it and the ways in which the project came about. So maybe I will try and outline that as part of this presentation. So ways in which the project came about and some key relevant findings that it yielded. It was quite a big project that took time, so hopefully I will be able to summarize it. But I will actually start by reading you a little bit from, there isn't that much to read really, just the opening, the very opening, the preface of the book. Because it's there to remind me, even though this book is called Aural and Aural Dramaturgies, and it's about speech and sound and in the digital age, theater in the digital age, but actually I am essentially someone who thinks through writing. So I don't want to forget that important aspect of this work. And in my preface, I write, between the ages of 4 and 6, I was fascinated by the idea of writing. In my birth country, Yugoslavia, we used to start school at 7, so this self-instruction predated my formal education. I had an old school primer, we call bookwork, in which each letter was laid out on individual pages with matching illustrations and lines to practice their cursive forms. And then somewhere towards the end, all 30 characters of the Serbian azbuka neatly laid out on the right-hand side of the picture of an old man with a red hat and a long mustache. The old man was called Vuk, literally wolf, but his slightly intimidating name and demeanor were of no concern, especially given that the other key cultural figure of my childhood, the author of the most ubiquitous children's poetry in Serbia, had the nickname Zmaj, meaning dragon. The Enlightenment among the South Slavs was a formidable project. Born in 1787, Vuk, full name Vuk Stepanović Karadžić, was named after the wild animal by his illiterate peasant parents, who had lost numerous babies beforehand in order to ward off evil spirits and keep this child alive. As it happens, Vuk did not only survive, but he gained immortality through his contributions to Serbian and South Slav culture. His work happened in the 19th century in the spirit of national reawakening and the pan-Slavic struggle for liberation from the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. An autodidact himself, Vuk fought to reform and simplify the official written language based on the Church Slavonic in order to bring it closer to the vernacular and make literacy available to the masses. His contemporary Ljudevit Gaj was undertaking similar efforts in Croatia, the result of which was an alignment of the standardized Croatian Latin alphabet and the Serbian Cyrillic. Both alphabets had now 30 directly corresponding letters, each of which also corresponded to a single sound, making them fully phonetic. These efforts later led to the official language of the state of Yugoslavia, Serbo-Croatian, being the only language in the world with 2 official alphabets. Not only did this make literacy more attainable, but we could also code switch in writing if we wanted to. Vuk followed me throughout my school life. We had this book of a diploma certificate you get for academic achievement and so on, which I, got. But more importantly, I retained the love of writing, while increasingly perhaps taking Vuk's role in it for granted. When I graduated from high school and left the war zone that remained of Yugoslavia, the culpability of Serbian nationalism in the ongoing war made me deeply ashamed of my ethnic origins. And I learned to write more fluently in English and dedicated myself to the study of theater. I never needed Vuk again, either. And he paled into oblivion. Or so I thought. There was an interesting moment in the course of putting the finishing touches to my PhD thesis in 2002 that took me on a long journey back to Vuk. Dealing with the overarching and in many ways fundamental research question of my PhD, why is there so little knowledge or interest in the Yugoslav and Serbian theater, literature, and culture in the English-speaking world, I came across the largely forgotten work of the American classicists Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who spent the early 20th century researching the so-called oral literature of the South Slavs. And on the basis of their field research, which involved phonographic recording of the extemporaneous performances of often illiterate folk singers from the Balkans, Parry and Lord developed the so-called oral formulaic theory. Its main premise was that oral composition contained a systematic use of patterns and rhythms within a specific meter, which retroactively also revolutionized academic understanding of Homeric verse authorship. Basically, that Homeric verse was an outcome of performance rather than being written to be performed. At exactly the same time, I coincidentally went to the cinema to see Curtis Hanson's film A Time, featuring Eminem. And in watching a rap battle scene, I realized I was watching the compositional process described by Parry and Lord as taking place in the performance of those Balkan singers. I have a link here to it, Maya. I will try this if people are interested later. You can click the links because it turns out I can't play sound in this presentation about the dramaturgies of sound and speech, but it's okay, you know. I speak, right? And this is actually not book. This guy here on the monument. This is a picture of a monument from my town where I come from. And this guy on the picture is called Filip Višnjić, and he was one of these performers, you know, who was in the 19th century performing these epics using this instrument called the gusle. Here is the instrument. And it's a one-string based instrument that they use as a kind of accompaniment, which kind of gives them a rhythm, which I suppose is what kind of the analogy is to hip hop, in a way that you have this meter that you use, and that in a way facilitates this extemporaneous performance. But the performance, these are illiterate performers, so they have never written down or read the songs that they are singing. They often make them up, and every single performer has their own version of them. And Vuk Karadžić, this guy with the red hat, he went around and collected these epics in the 19th century and wrote them down for the first time. He did quite a bit of ethnographic work. And, you know, he also writes in his various prefaces to his books about these singers that he met and what they were liked about them and what he didn't like about them. It's a very scant record of performance that we have from these people. What we have kept is this body of literature, which we call oral literature, and which forms the basis of our canon in the former Yugoslavia. But actually, we don't know very much about what these performances were like. And there was, however, this poetry became very popular in the 19th century all around Europe. Brothers Grimm translated it, Goethe translated it, Sir John Bowring translated it into English in 1827. And this is from his preface to his published collection of poetry, in which he says, he actually quotes one surviving record of the audience listening to these performances at the time. And he says, I cannot describe the pathos with which these songs are sometimes sung. I have witnessed crowds surrounding a blind old singer, and every cheek was wet with tears. It was not the music, it was the words which affected them. And now I was gonna play to you what this instrument sounds like, which is still played in Montenegro especially, but I don't have sound, and it's not necessarily sound that we are familiar with. It's quite a specific kind of sound. But I was going to show you in these two clips what an epic sung to the gusle sounds like, and then how a contemporary artist, Rambo Amadeus, has translated this same epic to the form of hip hop. And actually, Rambo Amadeus made his own version of this particular epic, Smrt Popa Mile Jovovića, in 1991, which was the time of the beginning of the war in Croatia. And he was using this song and this particular music video, in a way as a comment on what was going on in that situation. Because the song is really about, and the video, which uses the footage from Sergei Eisenstein's film Alexander Nevsky, is all about, bravado and going into war out of bravado rather than for particular, justified reasons. Now, going on. So that was one thing. So as I mentioned in this preface, that was one way of why I kind of got intrigued by this notion of orality. as a defining feature of the culture that I represent in this context, writing about it in the English language. And the way in which I was discovering its relevance through encountering how hip-hop was made, and how hip-hop also was starting to penetrate into theater production. And now, what is also relevant, maybe it's more, you can't read this, but it's just for me to remember to tell you about. Here I have the copy of the first page of the book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, by Marshall McLuhan. It's a book that was published in 1962. And in those very first sentences that I've highlighted in yellow, Marshall McLuhan talks about the significance of that work that Milman Parry and Albert Lord did in the Balkans, about that very ethnographic work they were doing, discovering how this extemporaneous poetry was being made. And that is quite significant for this project, because, in fact, one of the ways in which I framed the inquiry was through this idea. Well, there is the oral formulaic theory from Albert Lord and Milman Parry. There is McLuhan's The Gutenberg Galaxy, in which he talks about how the printing press really affected the way in which we were, we were producing culture. And then McLuhan's follower and colleague from the Toronto School of Education, Walter Ong, had his book written in 1982 called Orality and Literacy, in which he does this long historical retracing of the civilization, of the human civilization, which he says begins with orality, with what he calls primary orality. This is the age before literacy, before any kind of literacy existed. There was a particular way of communicating that was characterized by the oral, the spoken. And then when literacy is invented, we have the age of literacy. And then what Ong is observing in the 20th century with the advent of radio and TV and broadcasting technology is what he calls secondary orality. That orality, again, becomes more significant than literacy, but this time this orality is different from the primary orality. It's not, it's categorically different, he says, because this secondary orality is also informed by the processes of writing. So in a way, it's impossible for us to imagine what that primary orality was like. But what we are now kind of encountering is secondary orality, and this long historical kind of linear narrative is also seen by some other theorists. And here I have Lars Ole Sauerberg, Danish name, I hope I pronounced it okay. Ole Lars Sauerberg is the name of a scholar from South Denmark University, and his colleague Thomas Petit. Thomas Petit is a medieval scholar, and they propose the idea based on McLuhan of the Gutenberg parenthesis. That actually what we have is really, the original primary orality, then we have literacy, then we have the Gutenberg parenthesis, which is the time of the printing press. And that we are basically, according to them, exiting out of this Gutenberg parenthesis. We are exiting out on the other side of it and encountering the digital media, which offers a new form of understanding how we communicate. And I found that is a very attractive proposition. For example, the way Twitter could also be seen, or Twitter, or whatever it's called now, X, but at the time, Twitter as some sort of a cross form between oral communication and written communication, because it's got features of both. And this also, cross references with the thinking of Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who, from the Kenyan perspective, talks about the notion of orature, as in this oral literature, which is also very much present in the African cultures, which he sees as culminating in what he calls cyberture in the digital age. So in his essay, I think it was in Performance Research, maybe that this essay was published, I can't remember exactly, he proposes the idea of cyberture, even before Twitter. This was before Twitter. And I was interested in this kind of convergence of all these ideas that are interested in the oral and how that was, in a way, cross-referencing the moment we were living in, the moment of the digital age. At the same time, in 2002, when I was, the moment I watched the film Eminem, the Eminem film 8 Mile, at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, I encountered a very interesting example of a version of Shakespeare's play, The Comedy of Errors, by a Chicago-based company called the Comedy of Errors. And they made their version of this, which they call adaptation, in which everything was rendered up. And basically, it was a very successful piece of theater, which is here described by Gardner in her review as saying that even though they've changed all of the Shakespeare's verse, into hip hop, the story, and more importantly, a sense that all the original intent remained intact in this production. And she further says, Shakespeare offered his audiences the poetry of the times, and since rap is the poetry of ours, there seems nothing wrong with dragging a 16th century play into the 21st century. So, lots of things converging, lots of things converging and drawing attention to this, to the particulars of speech composition, of oral composition, which is different, it seems, from how we write. We compose our thoughts differently when we speak to how we compose our thoughts when we write. And I have to say, I compose my thoughts better when I write than when I speak. But I am, in the spirit of this project, forcing myself to speak. Another way into this project was this other form of theatre I was observing at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. I mentioned to the students this morning that the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is my main field of research. I have been going to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, I think, for nearly 30 years now, not every year, but for about 13 years I went as a theatre critic for the Stage newspaper. I went there for the whole month, from the beginning till end, saw hundreds of productions, wrote about them. We also gave out awards for Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Ensemble, and Best Solo Show every year. And as part of all of that, I was sort of observing these new trends that were emerging on the international scene, because Edinburgh Festival Fringe is often very international in nature. And one of the things that was emerging about 10 years ago was this trend of gig theatre. And by gig theatre, people who do it, or people who describe it as such, sometimes companies own it as a label, and sometimes they say, no, we are making theatre, but you can call it whatever you want, and then journalists call it gig theatre. Is the kind of theatre that looks like a music gig, but it often has the dramaturgy of a play, So you have like characters, you have the dialogue, and you have songs. But the only thing you have on stage is just microphones and amplifiers and a drum kit. So there is no scenery of any kind. And the storytelling basically appeals to the audience's imagination. You imagine the visual content in this work. But of course, this is a particular kind of dramaturgy that people consciously play with. And in different examples, it's kind of played out differently. This example here is interesting. This is a company called Middle Child, and their show from 2017 is called All We Ever Wanted Was Everything. And I have a clip here for that as well, which I can show you. This was commissioned, this play was commissioned from a playwright for the City of Culture celebrations in the northern city of Hull in England. And it was performed in a nightclub rather than in a theater. And the idea was that the audience could come and go freely, they could bring their mobile phones. They were at some point even encouraged and invited to use their mobile phone to live tweet from the performance. But the performance or the play that was written was very much what you would call, what Michael Billington would call, a state of the nation play. It was a kind of play you would expect to see in the National Theatre in London, because its structure was such that it was following two characters' journeys, a man and a woman who were born in 1987 in Hull, and we meet them every 10 years. We meet them in year 1987, we meet them in year 1997, we meet them in year 2007, and then we meet them in the year 2017. And every one of those years is a significant year in British history, because 2007 is the year when Tony Blair comes to power. 2017 is the year, 1997 is the year when Tony Blair comes to power. 2007 is the year when Tony Blair steps down and then paves the way for the changeover of government, which is not immediate, but happens a few years later. In 2017, we are dealing with Brexit. And so these are really important political moments that are charted through, or that represent the structure of this play. And of course, live music being used in this show was using the historical framework. So, we have music from all of those moments of history framing the experience. But it's not the only way in which gig theatre has used music. There have been other examples where, for example, a gig theatre piece might be committed to just one particular genre of music, or another piece which I discuss in this book in the gig theatre section called Electrolyte, which is about mental health, which uses different genres of music, and music is composed specifically for that production. Also uses this process of storytelling, which gives the audience a particular idea in their head about what they're watching, and then using the dramatic form to subvert that storytelling. So we actually basically find out that the narrator, who we've been following the whole way through, is an unreliable narrator due to their mental health issues, and we find that out at the end of that play. But it actually confronts us with a certain meta level of this experience, and forces us to think about this juxtaposition between what we hear and what we see. So what is shown and what is told. I'll come back to that. So that was, gig theatre became an area of interest that I wanted to address in this project. And I guess, so as I said, this was a triangulation between the state of the nation play, live music, and audience engagement or participation strategies. What was also happening in this work was a dissolution of boundaries between the medium of theatre and the medium of popular music, because these works often toured to music festivals as well as theatre festivals. And it was also a continuation of the reinvention of the contemporary ensemble, which was a subject of my previous research that I published in 2013, this book, Theatre Making, which was linked to this research into the contemporary ensemble, where I interviewed a whole number of people working in ensembles or using the ensemble way of working. Because quite a few of these playwrights that I interviewed as part of this work were telling me that they were working as though they were in a band, or that they were, or that they had the experience of being in bands. Or Simon Stevens told me that his plays were like the Pixies songs, you know, that actually they had the structure of the Pixies songs, which was the band that he liked. I kept coming across this reference. People were self-identifying in this way, and I thought it was interesting to acknowledge this merging of the genres of not genres, merging of the forms of theatre and live music, popular music, specifically here. This all, I saw it as being part of a wider oral turn in theatre, which also included new portable technologies, headphones, recorders, mobile phones, software. And also it included a resurgence of verbatim theatre in the 21st century. Verbatim theatre is linked to the documentary theatre of the 1960s and so on, but in the early 21st century, it was becoming popular again. And a lot of the time, it was in a way linked to the ease with which it became possible to collect testimonies in the process of making work. So rather than starting with a written play, artists were starting with collecting interviews about particular subjects. So this is the project. I spoke to the students this morning briefly about this. So this is the outline of its research questions. I wanted to theoretically frame this oral dramaturgies. I wanted to see correlations between the technological developments and contemporary performance making practices, and also identify compositional strategies that underpin performance making, which foregrounds orality and aurality. And it wasn't enough to just analyze these plays and these works of theatre and performance, but I wanted to observe and study the way in which they were made. I proposed to use a combination of oral history, contextual research, and rehearsal ethnography for this purpose. The project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, and it was done in partnership with Victoria and Albert Museum, Digital Theatre Plus, and Battersea Arts Centre. And because Battersea Arts Centre as a producing theatre in London was involved, we were able to commission or propose to commission artists, to commission 3 artists using a commissioning structure they call scratch performance, where an artist is commissioned for just 1 week at a time to create a work in progress and then share that work in progress in front of an audience, and use it as sort of match funding for getting the project off the ground and developing it through other means later on, but also use the audience feedback as a way of developing the work further. We were going to commission 3 artists for these scratch performances and then observe them in rehearsal for a week. And then we commissioned 4, and we had Sarah Getz, which was an artist from San Francisco who was proposing to do a project on neo-ventriloquism, which they were kind of developing as an idea of an artist finding their voice in the process of gender transitioning. We also selected Silvia Mercuriale, who works with headphone theatre, so she makes performances where the audience just listens to a series of instructions, but it does not have to be in the theatre. It is often site-specific. She was proposing to do a piece on swimming in swimming pools, and I didn't tell the students this morning that, I told them that she was proposing to make the piece about swimming in swimming pools, and the audience would come to a swimming pool and watch swimmers, and some of the swimmers were genuine swimmers and some were performers that formed this piece. And we were listening to something in our ears where we were experiencing some sort of a performance that was framing this reality. And because COVID happened, this was not possible. She ended up making a piece for the bathroom. So, and there was a version for the shower and a version for the bath. you know. We selected S.K. Shlomo, who was a beatboxer and wanted to do an autobiographical performance about mental health, and an ensemble of dancers called Graceful Collective, who wanted to make a piece about climate change, but they were using speech in their performance. So, you know, we hope that this will give us an interesting kind of constellation of insights into what it means to make theatre starting with speech and sound rather than starting with text. And then, of course, COVID happened, and we had to reinvent everything and made the whole project on Zoom. All of the interviews happened on Zoom. We expanded the artists that we originally, rather than having the 4 that we originally selected, we actually expanded it to a lot more people whose work was still relevant to our inquiry and who we discovered in the process of actually doing this research. And we ended up having 5 different kinds of, instead of this rehearsal ethnography we set out to do, we had a number of different kinds of interviewing artists and scholars, or holding space for them to share their thoughts and ideas with us. And we used, I ended up using those as a sort of network of insights that informed the research. Anyway, so, I mean, I try to explain that in the book in a bit more detail. But yeah, here are some of the people. Here is JQ from the Vomitive Errors, you know, that piece that I saw in 2002 in Edinburgh. We managed to reach out to him. He was free. Everybody was free in lockdown. He gave us the interview. ZU UK, based in London. Matthew Zia, who actually was involved with S.K. Shlomo's work, but he's a DJ. Matthew Zia is a DJ in his own right and a theatre director. He runs a theatre company in London, quite a good one as well. Maya Krishna Rao, who I discovered during the pandemic, an Indian maker who was trained in Kathakali but was using digital technologies very seriously, making new work and commenting on what was going on politically around her. Kate Carrier, who was born without a biological speech and was using assistive augmented communication technology and making work in this way, and making work with artists who were also using ANC technologies themselves. South African people, the Fall Ensemble, who made a verbatim piece about the Roads Must Fall protest that was going on in South Africa at the time. And in addition to this, I think it's also, I list here a few other theoretical frameworks and intersections that inform this work. So the thinking that went on in performance studies around the disciplinarity of performance studies and how it was trying to emancipate itself from literature, but somehow left the oral literature behind in the process of doing that. So Shannon Jackson writes about that in her book Professing Performance, which is a brilliant book, actually, also in relation to the topic we talked about this morning about the history of universities. And she talks about the history of the drama degree in America, brilliant work. But in that book, she also talks about how the oral was left behind as part of the canonic. And really what I'm trying to do here, it was part of the inspiration, was to rescue the oral from the canonic and to kind of bring it into the decolonial and the contemporary. Then, of course, rehearsal ethnography and various other kinds of ethnography were relevant to this thinking. Orality and Serbian orature I talked about at the beginning. The notion of musicalization in post-dramatic theatre and the ideas around bottom-up storytelling in jazz were quite influential in my thinking here as well. And then, of course, the thinking through sound itself, from scholars like Julian Henriquez, who has written about the Jamaican sound systems, acoustemology as an idea by Stephen Feld, where he proposes this idea of kind of knowing differently through sound. The notion of ontology of relational uniqueness from Adriana Cavarero, I found that extremely influential. She challenges the whole history of Western metaphysics by trying to promote the voice, the spoken word. The notion of metaxis from Jean-Luc Nancy, and as a way of organizing all of this, Bruno Latour's ACTA network theory. So I don't have the time to go through all of this, but maybe just to share some of the findings, and that's my last slide. Okay. Yeah. so that's my last slide. Oh, did we run out of time? No. Okay. So these are just some of the thoughts that the sonorous is tendentially metaxic, says Jean-Luc Nancy. And by metaxic, he means having to do with participation, sharing, or contagion. And that's the idea of the sound, you know, that's how it is ontologically different from the ocular centric, that it invites participation, as opposed to the mimetic tendency of the visual. The oral turn in theater in the digital age resolves the binaries between the oral and the visual, the digital and the analog, the textual and the embodied, because it's not really going any further. It's not changing. Theater is still theater. The only thing that is changing is the kind of configuration of these two different planes of meaning, really, that we are having on stage. Theatre makers themselves are products of various formative cultural influences. Peter Brook may not have been interested in using hip-hop in his work, but a contemporary theatre director will be, because that is something that has shaped them when they've kind of developed as an artist. Technological innovation brings about paradigmatic rethinking of form and its potential politicity. I'm really interested in that, how form can be political. I mean, we often think about content as political, but how can form be political? Digital recording tools are deployed by artists, they say, as collaborators. Quite a few of them have said that to me in interviews, that they use their mobile phones or their video cameras as collaborators in the creative process. And that embodied listening is valorized as a generative technique and as a mode of audience engagement. Technology contributes to theater's inherent sensory multimodality, but it is not indispensable. Sometimes technologically conditioned compositional logics result in low-tech manifestations. One piece of work that I have written about quite a bit in both this book and the previous book, Theatre Making, is Tim Crouch's play The Author, which I don't know whether you know it, but it's this is a still from that play where we don't have a stage, we just have the audience divided in half, and the four actors are interspersed in amongst them, and they're kind of talking to each other the whole time. I can talk about that later if anyone is interested, but I'm using it as an example of saying that actually you have the notion that it doesn't have to be high-tech, but we can still trace the influences of the digital age on why Crouch decided to privilege the spoken word here rather than anything else. The potential of technology to enhance accessibility and inclusivity is dramaturgically deployed. So it's not that we're just providing access for tokenist reasons. Those two build into the work itself. Technological tools promote and augment the post-punk, DIY, self-authorizing ethos of multi-professionalized theatre makers and their audiences. This is really a continuation of a thought I had in the previous work. And then oral and oral dramaturgies have decentering, decolonial, and democratizing potential. And finally, dramaturgical innovation is not contingent on digital technologies. It can also happen without. So that's some of my findings, not the key findings, not, I organized them differently in the conclusion to this book, but I kind of listed them in this way here. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
My question was only referring to this position of yours and the task of connected with the reparative artist-centered methodology, and this is, I think, a researcher's attitude too. So, could you speak a bit about this?
Yes, I mean, I spoke this morning a little bit to the students about this notion of reparative reading as opposed to the paranoid reading, the idea that Eve Kosovsky-Sedgwick proposes as a way of sort of questioning this whole tradition of hermeneutic approach to theatre study, or not in that case, literature studies, really, where we are just reading work and interpreting it and often interpreting it with a view to finding something that unconscious that is happening in the work. Obviously, the idea comes from Freudian theory. And Eve Kosovsky-Sedgwick proposes instead a reparative method of reading, which is one that it kind of has a more empathetic approach to the work being observed or studied. And I think that term as a way of describing the whole methodology. I mean, I haven't really found a very elegant way of describing my methodology. I've described it as using a number of adjectives such as artist-centered and reparative and coalitional, and I can't remember where that bit is in the book. Relational is another term that I use. And overall, I then settled for describing it as purely dramaturgical, kind of a dramaturgical research methodology, because I am interested in how the work is made rather than how we can analyze it from the critical theory tradition of scholarship. So, yeah.
Okay, I've prepared for you an anecdote, which is about Gustav. So it is about the image and sound relation. And Gustav, the king of Sweden, he was fond of hunting. Yes. And but as time went on, his sight became poor. And there was a habit formed in the court that people, when saw that the king raises his rifle, were shouting, "I am not the elk." And this was that saved their lives. But once there happened that he shot a man who was shouting, "I am not the elk." And the poor guy went to the hospital. The king visited the hospital, and the guy asked him what happened. It seemed to me that shouting, "I am not the elk," you shot me. Instead of sparing my life. And the king said, "You see, my sight is poor, but I don't hear quite well. And when you said I am not the elk, I heard I am the elk." That's why I trust you.
I see.
So, this is this is an absurd story, but I think it is very interesting from the point of view of the image and the sound. Which one is so? When there is the situation to come with an interpretation to clarify the content of the image, because if sight is damaged, then the image is not so clear. Image is said anthropologically the most clear and most, most true method or medium, as opposed to sound, which is unreliable and is by sound and by words, you can lie. So this is not a true medium. So what is your opinion? Are there cases when these two are opposed to each other? And one of them needs an interpretation, like I am the I'm not the and so on. So, of course, in theater, there is a specific situation when images are imaginary. In this kind of situation, you told now. But the question is this an outdated question connected to the truth of the medium?
You know, it's really interesting. I have talked about this work a few times now, and I keep coming back to the fact, one thing that I haven't written about in the book is the fact that actually this interest in what is seen and what is heard on the stage goes, I mean, it's very explicit and very present in Shakespeare's work. So Hamlet, for example, is all about the ear and what is heard and what is seen. What you know, seeing ghosts. Do you see the ghosts? What you hear, what you see, and so on. And I think, I mean, that's why the question mark at the beginning of this, is it an innovation for the digital age? Because I think that juxtaposition between what is heard and what is seen is in some ways fundamental to theatre. It's been there explicitly since Shakespeare, probably even before. It's, you know, the multimodality of theatre, actually, that we are using multiple senses in order to receive information. And I think this work that falls into this category is still doing those same things. But of course, there is always an element of playfulness in that, because that's what makes theatre interesting. When you are, I mean, well, that's what makes that anecdote interesting as well. You know, this deliberate kind of inversion of what is, you know, what the relationship between what is heard and what is seen is, because it involves the audience in the process of meaning making. So it's not, you know, you're not, the audience is not just there to receive meaning that is being transferred, but they have to do the work in order to understand what it is that they're seeing and experiencing. And that's why this work, The Author by Tim Crouch, do you know it? That's why it's really interesting to me as an example. Do people know The Author by Tim Crouch? Yeah, Carlos does. It's this work that has the audience divided in half. And it was a piece that was commissioned by the Royal Court Theatre in the year 2009, and it was performed in the same space where all of the famous in-your-face theatre works were performed, like Sarah Kane's Blasted, for example. And we know that Sarah Kane's Blasted was in a way referencing very explicitly Edward Bond's Saved, which was also commissioned at the Royal Court, shown at the Royal Court. And in Edward Bond's Saved, we have this, which was a very controversial play in its own time in the 1960s. We have this incident of a baby being stoned. You know, these characters are stoning a baby in a tram. And in Sarah Kane's Blasted, baby is eaten. And of course in Sarah Kane's Blasted, it's, you know, it's this emblematic play of the in-your-face theatre, like the gore and the violence is all openly on the stage. And Tim Crouch gets commissioned to do a play in the same space, and his approach is to do the exact opposite of all of that. So he will not have any violence on stage, but violence will happen in the audience's imagination. And because of how you are creating mental pictures when you're listening to a story. And the story is about a piece of theatre being made about beheadings in the Middle East and so on, but it culminates in a story about sexual abuse of a baby. So a baby is violated in this play as well, in the way that babies are violated in these previous plays of the royal court, but it's done through these different means of just listening about it, not watching anything. And that's a deliberate dramaturgical decision. Another part of the deliberate decision there is that we have like a space here of about 1 meter in between the two halves of the audience. And it's written in the conventions that an audience member at the beginning, like on page 3, gets up and walks out. And that sort of gives you the idea that you can walk out of this play at any moment in time. And then it becomes a play. It really, when it was performed in Edinburgh a year later, it really became a play where they were counting how many audience members walked out on any given day. But the point is that really the question is, what is your responsibility as an audience? And how do you choose to make sense of this play? If you stay in this play and some people were outraged by the content because, they weren't thinking necessarily about any of this, any textual background to this play because they were not necessarily informed or interested in it, and that's okay. They don't have to be. But I think what also this play forces you to do is to somehow complete the semantic gap, as I call it, after you've finished watching this play. So you can only make sense of this play after you've left. You can't make sense of it in the process of watching. So it kind of forces, in a Brechtian way, it sort of forces you to delay that process of making sense of it and viewing it critically rather than viewing it just literally in terms of what the story is. Mm-hmm. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Yes, yes, you did. And we'll have one more question. I think everybody is interested in. We know that you're engaged to theory and practice as well, and you used to be a dramaturg. And I'm interested whether you use, and I'm sure you do, you use the findings and results of your research connected with this oral dramaturgies, whether you use them when doing dramaturgy.
Yeah, it's. The project is quite fresh still. It's relatively recent in the sense that the findings. The book only came out in 2023. So I haven't. I have used some of the insights from this project in a number of ways. One is that I worked with, in fact, during the pandemic, as I was writing the book, I was asked by a group of artists in Italy to work with them on Zoom. They wanted to. They were working on a way in which they were working on bringing audiences back to the theatre after the lockdown, and they were exploring a number of different ways of doing that through sound, through kind of incorporating social distancing into the process. And I was literally talking to them at the same time as finishing this project, and sort of course, the thinking about speech and sound was informing this process in some way. I had also, prior to doing this research, worked with groups of students at Central on creating immersive performances using sound. So in a way, I have explored it. We did a version of, for example, it all started with a version of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where we used the roots of the 5 central characters that are described in the novel as they walk through London. And we sent audiences on 5 different routes through London, following those routes and listening to particular soundscape, and then they all end up together in a building that used to be a building where Virginia Woolf's family used to live, and we have a party as a kind of finale for that, you know. But sound was quite important in that, or it emerged as an important or a useful. Not everybody, not every group of students use it, but it emerged as a really useful tool in managing those audience journeys. So you know, I was kind of trying to understand it experientially as well as working with oral histories and interviews and drawing insights from the work of others. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Please ask your questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Duška, again for bringing us inside of your artistic practice. I'm curious about the poetics of affection and multilingualism, because I've been interviewing people in Brazil and bringing this into having a migrational background, so bringing this into Scandinavia. And also yesterday I was thinking a lot about doing Alaska play that I couldn't understand and I couldn't see at a certain point, and actually I didn't need it because I was allowing some part of my brain to flow within the fluctuations, the kind of affections that the language would bring me, how the speech was constructed. Also because in Scandinavia you have these languages who are very much informed by certain rhythms. That, for example, in Danish, I experienced this as a person who's learning Danish, is that you have to say words in a certain rhythm, otherwise they don't understand. Even if you say the correct pronunciation, if you don't put in that rhythm, they don't understand. Yes. So I'm just curious because also when the experience of bringing voices who speak Portuguese into Scandinavia is that quite often people tell me, I don't need to understand. I kind of can follow their speeches and whatever they are saying, the nature or the emotions that they bring, even without understanding the words. So I'm curious if you've been also investigating the poetics of affection.
Not the poetics of affection, it's a new idea. Thank you for that. I might have to look into that. I like the sound of it. But multilingualism was something that I thought was going to be one of the next steps after this project. I explored it for a while, especially with my move to Sweden and becoming aware of different languages becoming really. I mean, I already have in my family different languages on a daily basis. Because of course there is a thing known as oral racism as well. That actually the people can have prejudice based on how people sound as well, which is an interesting, which kind of like I came across as a result of researching oral and aural dramaturgies, this notion of oral racism kind of cropped up, because I'm more fond of reparative rather than paranoid readings of culture, I was more interested in the affordances of multilingualism rather than this sort of more concerning aspect of how you might expose yourself to prejudice through speaking other languages. I don't have a very elegant answer, I'm afraid, but yes, it's certainly been crossing my mind. It's an area I'd be interested to think through more.
Okay, other questions? Yeah, Vedika?
I'm very interested in this thing you mentioned that form can be political. I also write about this in my research, and I was just wondering if you could share some examples or findings that you have come across in yours about this.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, for example, the author is a really good example of that. It's making different demands of the audience to what they're used to. You know, it's not enough to just sit back in your seat and just receive the story and then go away and compare notes with your with people that you're there with. You somehow have to make sense of what you've been confronted with on an affective level and on an intellectual level. That's another that's another juxtaposition that takes place in that way as well. But on the other hand, it's not, so it is making a different demand of the audience that's, that's more than just sitting in your seat, but it's not making any more demands that are any more uncomfortable than that. Like, for example, that it's asking the audience to get out of the seats and do things or come on stage or whatever, like some of the other people might be doing. So in a way, it's a very smart thinking through form, that actually I am always very interested in how content and form are interrelated in any work, in any piece of work, how artists find new form for exploring the content. I want to give you another example of this, and that's the German artist Oliver Zahn here. And Oliver Zahn, I discovered him during COVID because he was invited to come to Newcastle Gateshead Gift Festival, which takes place every year in May. And he was supposed to come with a piece called In Praise of Forgetting. And this piece, and the photo we are seeing here is from the piece, In Praise of Forgetting. It started off, the departure point was the fact that he found an archive of recordings of the German expellees. By expellees, he means people, German-speaking population that lived in non-German lands, who after the Second World War were expelled from like Romania, Serbia, and other places and sent back to Germany. And these Germans were interviewed by a certain ethnographer at the time. They were interviewed about their migration and also about songs they were singing. And so they recorded some of these songs. And Oliver Zahn was saying, okay, but actually most of these people who were interviewed were Nazi sympathizers. So why are we still keeping their testimonies? What's the point of still memorializing this? And he decided to make a piece where he replicated these reel-to-reels. They were recorded using reel-to-reel tapes. He replicated all of the reel-to-reels from the archive and then created this sort of Jenga structure on the stage. And the performance consisted of him pulling out randomly tape during the performance and playing it. And I don't know actually what that performance looked like in detail because I did not see that performance. But what I did see, and this is where it gets interesting in terms of form and content, was In Praise of Forgetting 2, which was a reworking of that stage show that he made for COVID circumstances, because he couldn't come to Gift Festival in Newcastle in person to perform this show, and he did not want to send a video recording of that show. He basically made a new performance with the same materials that he was going to perform on his desktop on Zoom. And so the performance takes on a completely different form, So suddenly we are able to also, he first of all uses text boxes. He has a Mac computer, he uses these text boxes in which he live writes. So he doesn't speak, it's a completely silent performance. And he has this live writing going on, and he's sharing files from his computer, like audio files and YouTube videos, and kind of giving us background to this story and showing us these people and so on, playing these songs to us. And then, and I'm sorry, spoiler alert, and then he bins everything using the bin icon on the Mac desk, you know. And I mean, you know, I really admire that way of thinking about how the content is reflected in the form, you know, how he finds the form that in a way takes the content and its investigation further. But it's just an example. I think my ideally there are countless numbers of ways in which this can happen. So there isn't just one right way, but yeah, I think form can be political. Yeah.
We have 2 more minutes. If somebody has a question of 2 minutes and a 2 minutes answer to it, Mari, please.
There are so many questions, but I would like to hear your opinion about the influence of these techniques on playwriting, if you can think of, because you mentioned important plays like Hétfőn and how this can inform playwriting. What do you think?
Yes, let's see, who was the playwright here? I do have some, like these 2 women, Dash, they write plays, and they write plays that they sign off as Dash. So they don't sign it off using their personal names, they sign them off using company names. This project here is a playwright-led project. It was a piece called Reassembled Slightly Askew, which was written by a Canadian playwright based in Belfast called Shan Yi. And she had this experience where with sinusitis gone wrong, where she was in a coma for us. She had some sort of a brain injury caused by sinusitis that sent her into a coma. And when she came out of this experience, she was very keen to write a play about it. And she worked with a Swedish dramaturg who works in Ireland called Hannes Lettner on finding the best possible kind of form, again, for this play. And they decided that actually putting the audience in the position of the patient was what they wanted to do. So they wanted to use headphones as a way of, and the idea was the audience would attend this performance one by one, and they would be in a room lying on a hospital bed and having this the headphones as the main source of storytelling, and kind of going through this experience that, I mean, it's a bit more sophisticated than what I'm just saying. I'm kind of simplifying it a bit. But what we found quite interesting about this example was that actually doctors were totally fascinated by this. There is an interview at the end of this, because there is a website. Did they say there is a website? Yeah, so there is a website where all these interviews are. And so there is this interview with this writer and this dramaturg, and they show us at the end an interview that they did with the consultant, the doctor who was operating on this playwright. And he's speaking from his position and saying, I'm just a hard-nosed scientist and I'm very skeptical about the arts. But this piece of work is, I want all my colleagues to experience, because it really gives you a different kind of perspective on what it means to be a patient with this condition, So that's one example again, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there is no more time for other questions. Just think at them and run time to solve them and answer them. Okay, thank you very much for your lecture, and thank you for
Pause.